Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Inclusion Exchange. Today's episode will be focused on transforming workplace cultures through positive action. Our host, Natalie Denny, will be interviewing Joseph Harker, Senior Editor of Diversity and Development at The Guardian, as he talks about initiatives that he's implemented over the last 20 years to improve recruitment and retention of ethnic minority journalists.
I'm really honoured today to be here for the launch of the Inclusion Exchange and introduce our fabulous guest. So our guest is Joseph Harker. He is Senior Editor, Diversity and Development at The Guardian. He is also a columnist and former Deputy Opinion Editor. For 20 years, Joseph has run The Guardian's Positive Action Scheme, which offers enhanced work experience to aspiring journalists who are ethnic minority or have a disability. Many have gone on to have fantastic, successful media careers. Before joining The Guardian, Joseph was editor and publisher of the weekly newspaper Black Briton. And prior to that, he was assistant editor at The Voice. He tweets at Joseph Harker. And I am just honoured to have Joseph here today. So welcome, Joseph.
Hi, Natalie, and thanks for those very kind words. Thank you. And thanks to IO too for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be part of your launch program today. So I'm very very humbled to be part of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Joseph. So I'm just going to explain. We have got a Q&A function today on our webinar. And what we're going to do is, if you want to ask questions throughout, and we'll keep checking, and if they're relevant to that particular topic that we're talking about, we'll try and include them. So it's quite conversational in the way that we conduct ourselves today, and quite relaxed, but also dealing with them issues that are really important to the work that we do. So the first question that I've got for you, Joseph, is how did you get into what you do?
Oh, well, that's a very long story. I guess it has its roots in back in the 1980s and early 90s when I was in the black press. And it was a kind of very tumultuous decade. And we were, I was part, campaigning. The Voice and Black Briton were campaigning newspapers. And we were talking about racial injustice a lot. And so when I came to The Guardian, which I've been at The Guardian since 1992, I couldn't just stop, I couldn't sort of end all the campaigning for racial justice that I'd been doing all those years. So it was kind of, in a way, difficult time at the time, because the Guardian, like all of the national press at the time, was kind of very white dominated, very Oxbridge, and not very inclusive at all. But so I would make the case for change, but it often wasn't heard. But it took the McPherson inquiry, which some of the older members of the audience might remember, which was the inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the botched police investigation. And that really opened the doors, because it defined this concept of institutional racism, which is basically where an institution can work in a racist and exclusive way without individuals actually having to be racist, but they just adopt the culture of the organization, which sort of indirectly excludes people of color. And that was a moment when I think the Guardian realized that it had an issue to deal with. And because it wasn't, that it was clearly there were so few people of color in the Guardian or in any national newspaper at the time, that there clearly had to be some kind of problem. And the Guardian sort of accepted that. So I got together a group of people of color at the Guardian. There were about 10 of us at the time, 10 to 12 of us. And we sort of lobbied inside the Guardian for change. I met with the editor, and, we spoke with a united voice, and we managed to get the editor to accept there was an issue and to start changing things. And basically, for the last 20 plus years, that's what I've been doing in lots of ways. And what I've learned is that no matter you overcome one obstacle, and all you find is behind that obstacle another obstacle. And so what you think initially as being the answer to everything, you realize doesn't actually make that much difference unless you do something else as well. And it's been those last 20 years where I've learned sort of lots of things about what underpins sort of institutional racism, but institutional discrimination in general, about what keeps out disadvantaged groups. It's cultural. Some of it is explicit, but most of it is implicit. Often it's not that people want to actually exclude minorities. It's that just the way that systems work acts to exclude minorities. And it becomes a two-way thing. Both the image that the institution gives and its history signifies that it's a kind of an institution for posh white people, and also which means that people don't come into the organization. They're not beaten down the door to get into an organization which they see as not being for them. And at the same time, there are sort of legacy issues in which sort of the way people work, even with good faith, they don't know exactly what changes to make or how to do it, how to contact, how to target excluded minorities, how to go about bringing people in. Once they're in, how to have an inclusive environment that makes people feel valued and makes people thrive within the organization. And it's just been a very long learning process. But I think The Guardian, I'm sort of very proud to say that The Guardian is streets ahead, in my view, of any other national media organisation. I probably exclude the BBC in that, but certainly in terms of newspapers, it's well ahead of that, of any other newspaper group. And we're by no means where we need to be, but we are well ahead of the others, and we have many more Black and Asian and ethnic minority journalists here than we had 20 years ago, many more than work at any other newspaper organisation. So but as I say, with each bit of progress, you find that there are other things that you have to deal with, other issues you have to deal with. So yeah, it's been a learning curve, and I'm still learning.
Definitely. And I think one of the things I talk about in this type of work is that it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's something that needs that constant sort of commitment to. And, as you said, the learning curve, we're behind the big rock. There's another big rock, and then there's a mountain. But we persevere. We definitely persevere.
Well, maybe, Natalie, on that point, you say it's a marathon, not a sprint. But I think in a way, everyone, when they get into this, that they look for quick solutions, and they just want some magic. Oh, well, if I just do that, will it solve the problem? And with senior leaders who tend to be white middle class, they're just looking for, and I think they compare it with the changes that were possible on gender, and changes in gender were much easier, much quicker, because the white men in charge always knew white women, be that daughters, wives, friends, whatever. And so it was very easy. There was a readily accessible network there that they could, make quick changes and bring in women. Whereas when it comes to ethnic minorities, and you could say the same even for people with disabilities, there's not, there are no connections there for people to be able to make those quick wins. And in a way, we need to be careful how we phrase it. I think back to when Boris Johnson announced the lockdown 2 years ago, and I think he said it's going to be for 3 weeks. He's going to shut down the country for 3 weeks. And I remember my kids saying, 3 weeks? I can't deal with not being able to go to a nightclub for 3 weeks. But obviously that ended up being a much longer period. And I think if we start out telling people it's a marathon, then I think we risk people losing the will to keep going. So if we say this is going to be a really, really long, hard slog before you get there, then I think we risk people almost giving up before they start, because they have to be really, really committed. But I think we need to show that there are things that can be done, that changes that can be made, and it's like stepping stones along the way, milestones, and there will be quick changes you can make, and there'll be changes that you'll make that will take longer to click in.
Yeah, and I think what you touched on there is the idea of like intersectionality as well, about how there will be sort of intersects within there in terms of disability, in terms of gender, and how that's right across the board as well. I wanted to ask you 2 questions in relation to, the origin question. What was the most positive thing that came out of that for you? And also, what were the hardest parts about your journey?
The most positive parts early on, do you mean, or over the years?
You can. I'm up to you to interpretation. You can tell me both.
Okay. absolutely straight on. What was the most positive was in this moment, which was basically Britain's George Floyd moment, which happened in 1999, when people realised, the debate shifted so that people realised that racism was an issue that British institutions needed to deal with. What for me was the most positive, and has continued to be the most positive, has been that bringing together of people of colour in a united way. And, up to that point, we were all probably the newest people in the building, the most junior people in our departments, and all our common experience was we were the only person of colour. Whichever department we were in, we were the only person of colour in that department. So we had a very lonely existence, in which any issues that we had or any questions we raised, anytime we challenged the senior managers on what was going on, we were told, well, this is the way things are, this is why it happens like that, and everything was basically fobbed off. And that moment with bringing together, and like I say, it was only like 10 to 12 people in that very first meeting, was, all right, whichever section of this organization you work in, we've got these common experiences, and that we feel we feel like we're not listened to. We feel non-valued. We don't feel like we can put ourselves forward. We don't feel we get a fair hearing, and being able to come together, and then you realize actually we're all in this together, aren't we? We've all got these. We all feel isolated in our workplace, in our department, but when we come together, we actually can share experiences, and then taking that experience and then talking in a united way and taking it to the person at the very top of the organization and say, listen to us, this is what our shared experiences are. And the person at the head, who was our editor at the time, could not ignore us. We could be picked off individually, but when we're coming together saying, actually, this is our experience of working here, then in a way, we were unignorable. And that has been the most positive thing. And just over the years, at various points, us coming together, sharing our experiences, giving each other strength has been the thing that has kept us going, and has certainly kept me going all those years, because I know that whatever change I make, however small that happens to be, I know that there are people around who appreciate it and who value what's done. And even if it's just speaking up and saying, I don't think we got that article right, or that piece we published wasn't done the right way, then knowing that there are other people around who think, yeah, I'm pleased you said that, because I thought it, but I wasn't going to mention it. And that's been a really, that has been, the most positive, and it continues. And so I would urge anyone in any organization who's in that, and whatever minority you are, it could be you're a person with a disability, could be that you're LGBTQ, but I'd say come together, share your experiences, and then take your experiences to the people at the top of your organization and speak with one voice. And that's how you can get change done, and also how you can keep each other motivated.
Brilliant. And what about the hardest thing about the experience that you've had?
I think the hardest thing has been just the way that you think. You go into these things thinking that you've got problems solved. I mean, I'll give you an example. The early on, the Guardian, like other national newspapers, never used to advertise any vacancies at all. It was always felt like the right people will know about the jobs, and if you don't know about the jobs that are going at the Guardian, then you're not the right kind of person. And as I say, that just throughout the whole of Fleet Street, throughout the whole of the British press, that was the attitude. That was, literally centuries of culture that had created that sort of attitude. And so we thought, well, let's start advertising our jobs in the newspaper. And then that was a battle to get that done, but we got that done. And we advertised the jobs in the newspaper, and then realized, but the same people are getting the jobs. It's made no difference at all to the organization. And then you realize, why are the same people getting the jobs as always did? Well, first of all, people weren't really applying, as for the reasons I've mentioned before about minorities thought, well, the Guardian isn't interested in people like us, because certainly the image we give out was not at the time an inclusive image. And also the people, often jobs were going to people who had the experience, who knew how the organization worked, who'd written for us, who'd done subbing shifts, who'd done shift work for us, who freelance for us, and they were the same old middle-class white people. And so, and even objectively, they were actually best suited for the roles that were for the vacancies that we had, because they knew it. They knew the organisation. They knew how it worked, and they would perform way better in an interview. So that's maybe the first thing I did was early on with the managing editor Chris Elliott at the time, set up this scheme, the Positive Action Scheme, which was a scheme where we could directly target Black and Asian young aspiring journalists to say, come to The Guardian, get experience. And the aim was to, if we directly target them, which we could do under the Race Relations Act, because if it's like equivalent to an access scheme, it's a 2-week work experience scheme, which you can target minorities specifically. And we said, come here. I knew from having spent 5 years in the Black press that there were lots of brilliant young journalists around, well, brilliant journalists of any age around, who just weren't getting a break in the national press. I knew that from having seen them. And I thought, well, at the moment, The Guardian isn't, they're not on The Guardian's radar at all. So I thought, let's get a scheme, let's bring them into The Guardian so our editors here can see how many brilliant, young, talented, motivated, gifted people there are. And at the same time, encourage them to apply here, let them learn about what it's like inside a national news organization, let them see, let them feel, let them make the contacts, let them demystify the whole experience of working in a national newspaper. And, we took on 6 people in that very first year. And I'm not saying that this has been typical of our success at all. But now I'm looking back and thinking in that very first year, in 2002, 20 years ago, of the 6 people we took on, 2 went on to work at the BBC. 1 ended up being the Financial Times West Africa correspondent, and 1 is currently the Guardian's own features editor. So it shows that there really was a massive pool of talent out there who weren't getting it. And so over the years, that scheme we've taken on well over 200 people, many of whom have gone on either to work at the Guardian or other national newspapers or the BBC and other major broadcasters in that time. So we've sort of, there's often a sense at the time that if we take on ethnic minorities, it somehow means that we're going to have to lower standards. And I was, so, and the other thing I should sort of make clear, for the scheme, people applied, we interviewed. So I wanted to make sure that everyone was of a really high standard so that they would know. I'll only take on people who I see as potential Guardian journalists of the future. And so it meant that when they came in, editors could see how good they were. And also that meant when they see how good they were, they could also give them more interesting tasks. And we gave them a mentor as well. So the mentor would be a person of color, a journalist at The Guardian who's a person of color. And they could, sit down with them, encourage, tell them how to make the most of their time here, give them careers advice. And those mentors, I'm still in touch with people who were here 20 years ago, and those have been continuing relationships that we've built up. So it's been a way, as I say, of opening the door, demystifying the idea of the national newspaper, and also letting people here see how many brilliant young people of color there are out there, and that you don't need to feel that you're doing it as a charity thing, or that you're doing it to help them. It's actually making The Guardian, making this institution a better organisation.
Amazing. That's a fantastic scheme. And I do really love the point about this idea of we're not lowering standards, we're just opening people's eyes to how talented our Black and people of colour are in various fields. I think there's quite a misunderstanding around positive action, and it is seen as something which is, we are lowering standards, when actually it's the complete opposite. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to go to one of the questions that we've got, because we've got quite a few already, which we'd be happy to know. So the first one is, how were you able to demonstrate to the senior leadership team that they were reinforcing institutional racism?
Well, I'm a very diplomatic person, and I really believe in getting things done. I really believe in making change, but I also think that in order to make change, you can't alienate the people at the top. I'm originally from the city of Hull, which I read a piece a couple of years ago saying Hull people are the most stubborn people in Britain, and I probably people quite know, I say I'm just stick to my views and whatever, my principles, and other people call it stubborn, but I don't take no for an answer. So I will be very polite and I'll be very, unthreatening. But at the same time, I'm also very insistent. And if something's wrong, so I certainly didn't go around saying the Guardian is racist. The Guardian is racist. You need to change. I just said, it's clear we have an issue here. And it's clear that if these are people's experiences, then we need to do something about it. And like I say, I think the fact that we had, and I say, and I can't emphasize enough, no matter how small the number of you are, if you speak with one voice and if you have a shared experience, then people have to listen. They can isolate you individually saying, well, he's just a troublemaker, she's just a troublemaker. But if there's even 5 of you saying, this is what our common experience is, then they can't. Everyone likes to think of themselves as a liberal and modern and progressive. And if they haven't, if everyone who's from a certain background in that organization says, look, mate, you're failing, then they can't ignore that. So without having to label them racist, we said, we have to do something here. We have issues here. And there are clear examples. So my background is actually science. My degree's in chemical engineering. So I'm very much about evidence. I'm very much about statistics. And I'm very much about, if we have no people at all in a senior level, if everyone in our, it's now whatever it was, 50 years since the Windrush. And if every Black or ethnic minority person in this organization is at the most junior level, then what's the progress here? How do you see people progressing? How do you welcome people? And if we're all having these sort of negative experiences, what are you going to do about it? Because you could say if it was 1 or 2 of us, then maybe we're the problem. But when you see it so common, then you have to question whether the institution has a problem. And I think maybe in a way that now people are recognizing that, that institutional cultures can be negative, again, without, I think this idea of institutional racism was so helpful because you didn't have to label individuals as racist. You just had to say it operates in this kind of a way. So it was, and so I would point out specifics, like if there was a story which was really clearly obvious that we ran, which was really clearly, obviously wrong, then I would point that out. There were lots of times when there were kind of grey areas, and it was like could be, and our emphasis was maybe on this point rather than on that point. I didn't bother challenging anyone on those kind of things. I mean, I'll take an example, a more recent example from last year, where you'll probably be aware of the Harry and Meghan's Oprah Winfrey interview, and they talked about the British press as being racist, and they talked about their coverage, the coverage of them being racist, and it sparked a lot of talk on Twitter, on social media, and then the head of the Society of Editors said, first of all, the coverage of Harry and Meghan isn't racist, and then secondly, he said, and there's definitely no racism in the British press. Now, there's two issues there. One is the coverage of Harry and Meghan racist? And I say we can argue for hours endlessly over whether the coverage of Harry and Meghan is racist, and people will point to positive coverage, people will point to negative coverage, and you'll never win that argument either way, because there's just too much. It's almost a pointless argument. I know what I know. Other people can know what they know or believe what they believe. But I'm not going to get into that kind of argument. But when this director of the Society Editors said there is no racism in the national press, then at that point I say, oh, hold on a minute. This is clearly wrong. You cannot go against. You're a white man. You cannot deny the experiences of virtually every person of colour in the British press. You cannot say that. You cannot claim from your position, which is entirely ignorant of the problem, that there is no racism. What evidence do you have to claim that? And that's when, some of us here at The Guardian, we organised a petition of, a letter which got hundreds of signatures saying, the Society of Editors must retract this statement. It took them, although the director actually resigned, it took 6 months, and I was in at least half a dozen meetings I had with senior figures in the Society of Editors to say, this is crazy, you must retract this statement. They didn't want to do it. They admitted, they kind of realized that what he said was rubbish, but they didn't want to officially retract that statement. And that's the kind of thing I just kept going. And it took them till the end of, it happened in March, it took them till the end of August to actually finally retract that statement. If they hadn't retracted that statement, I would still be on their case now, telling them to do it. So, but because that was such a clear, glaring error, and and if the Society of Editors is saying there is no racism, then in a way they're denying all our experiences, and things will never ever change in the business. So it was just a really important battle. It's a really important battle to win. And so I was just going to keep going until we got them to concede. So that's kind of maybe an example. I'm forgetting what your question was now, but is that an example?
It was just about sort of demonstrating, reinforcing institutional racism, but I definitely think you answered it, and talking about consistency, talking about your approach and diplomacy, and I'm talking about putting it together. So you definitely answered it, Joseph.
Choose your battles. I guess choose your battles is the point.
That's it. Yeah, thank you very much. So the next question is from myself. What are the different barriers and experiences that can restrict diversity and inclusion in journalism and writing in general?
Well, first of all, I have this concept called everyday inclusion, which I'm really keen to sort of spread out and spread everywhere. I think we tend to think that I'll give you my scientific background, that there's a law of science, Le Chatelier's principle, in which he says, if a system is in a settled state, any change you make to that system, if you make any change to that system, the system will attempt to go back to that settled state. So if you think of it, if you have a bath full of water at room temperature, and you pour in a kettle of boiling water, before long, the bath will have settled back to its original temperature. If you want to change the temperature of the bath, you need to keep the hot tap running. You can't just turn it off. You need to keep it at that new temperature, because every system tries to revert to the status quo. Every time you change there's an inertia. Some people just call it inertia, but the system is always battling. So if everyone goes on a race equality training course, for example, you do a day on a training course, everyone goes into thinking, they go back thinking, oh, I want to change. Yes, I really believe in this. I want to go back. You go back to your desk, and everything about the institution tells you to do things exactly the way you've always done them. Every reminder, every prompt you have, every phone call you have, every email, every conversation you have with the people around you, every time you talk to someone outside the organization, it's another nudge to revert back to the way that you've always done things. So you have to think about this every day. And I think too often people think of diversity and inclusion as being let's do it in an annual appraisal, or let's do it in terms of job recruitment, which means that you think of it when you're recruiting for a job, or you think of it when in your annual appraisal, but all the days in between that, you're not thinking of it. And so this idea, everyday inclusion, is something where to try and get us thinking about this every single day, that we need to be thinking about difference and diversity in every decision we make every day. And it's quite, in a way you could think it's quite a difficult concept. But if we start thinking, instead of going to the same old people to do the same old thing, I'll try and every day, today, I will look for new and different people to do. And maybe I'll look for new and different people to do the same old thing. Or maybe I'll go to the same old people to do a new and different thing. But whatever, I'll be thinking constantly about trying new ways to do things, and just trying to. And so in a way, my muscle memory becomes thinking about newness and differentness rather than oldness and sameness. And if we can do that, then that's what we really need if we're really going to change systems and change institutions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And what factors do you think influence people of colour going into journalism or indeed leaving it?
Well, I think into another thing which I find quite I've been doing this for 20 odd years, and one thing I found, I obviously found that the Black Lives Matter the moment that we are still in of Black Lives Matter and the movement and the calls for change. One thing I found was the energy, and it was great that people were saying and wanting change and pushing for change. I found that exhilarating. I found it inspiring, still do. One thing I found really depressing was that the number of conversations I had where people were saying the same kind of things that were being talked about 20 years ago, as if it was new. And there's a classic one, which is where, we need to go into schools to try and encourage people to become, in this instance, journalists. As I say, since I was in the black press in the 1980s, we have had no shortage of people who want to be journalists. We don't need to be going into schools and encouraging people. The problem is the people who want to be journalists aren't allowed through the door of the mainstream media. And so we've got loads of people trying to get in. We've had that in sports, environment coverage, you name it, finance, people want to get into journalism. And so in a way, don't patronize us and say it's all our fault because we're not coming forward. People are coming forward. They want it. They've never had the breaks. There's so many journalists who've left the profession because the opportunities just weren't there. So many great journalists as well. So I think that in terms of getting, once organizations open the doors and let people know, wow, we're open for business, we want people like you, then people will come. But the other thing I think is will people stay? Will people thrive? And I think too often people think we can just have one brown person in, stick them in that department. And I say, like our experience in the 1990s, where you're there, you're not valued, you feel that you have to leave your history and your background at the front door before you come in. You have to act like some middle-class white person and mimic what they do if you're going to be accepted. And that's a position which it's a miserable position to be in. Do you have to reject all of your history and background and culture in order to get on? Or do you have to, or if you keep with your background and being true to yourself, does that mean you have to give up on having a career? And that was basically, for years, that's been a stark choice. And I think in other organizations, that is still a stark choice that people face. So there's a great quote that the sort of legendary campaigner Angela Davis gave to my former Guardian colleague, Gary Young. And she said, there's a model of diversity, she said, as the difference that makes no difference, as the change that brings no change. It's this cosmetic difference that makes that where nothing ever changes. If senior leaders are serious about diversity, they have to be serious about inclusion as well. They have to be serious about making people who come into the organization feel valued, feel like they belong, feel like they're being given a fair hearing. Because let's face it, the history of most institutions in this country has not been to treat us fairly, either by, like I say, either deliberately or accidentally, as much as that definition of institutional racism found. It's just we don't feel we belong in these institutions. There's nothing that, when we get into them, there's nothing that's done to make us feel like we belong. So leaders have to reach out to people who are different, and whether that's, and you can hear the same whether it's women coming into sort of traditionally male organizations, working class people, northerners, or whatever. But certainly when it comes to black people and ethnic minorities in these institutions, we are made to feel like outsiders and make us feel, you need to do something to make us feel that we belong. And so that's what I would urge people to do. The onus is on the leaders to change, to bend and make people feel included, not on the people who have the least power, who are the newest in an institution to have to do all the work, because they have the least opportunity to make change.
Yes, I completely agree. I think when I do work in terms of from a consultancy perspective, we look at retention rates, not just entry rates. So the idea of what are you doing to not just bring someone into the organisation from a different background, but also invest in them. How many people from a Black background or an ethnic minority background are in your senior leadership, not just at their lower paid rate levels. So it's about that whole holistic approach to that. So I really agree with that. Thank you so much, Joseph. So we're going to go to another question from our audience now. I forgot to say the first question was from Maria. So thank you very much, Maria. Second question is from Emma. And Emma has said, it's great to hear about the strides made in gender and race equality. I'd be interested to know how intersectional you think that work is, and whether you think the Guardian Group is a safe and inclusive space for trans people.
Okay, well, I'll tackle that directly. I mean, in terms of intersectionality, I mean, if we're talking about race and gender, the thing I've found for the most part is that it's the scheme I run, the Positive Action Scheme, is predominantly female. And I think there's a real issue actually in terms of the lack of Black men coming through. And I think that's one that society itself has done very little to acknowledge that, so in terms of gender, I'm delighted that there's been so many women come through. I think in my generation, it was predominantly Black men who were making strides. The few of us at that time who were making strides were mainly male. Nowadays, gender-wise, it's far more. There's far more women coming through, which is great. But at the same time, I'm slightly concerned about the lack of Black men. But in terms of if we're talking about other LGBT disability, I think we're still to see sort of major moves on that, major progress on that. Although there are signs of progress, but on the trans issue in particular, which I'll separate from the race issue altogether, the Guardian has had had a really sort of difficult time on the trans issue. We have our sort of traditional feminists who sort of long sort of led the sort of Guardian's always been very strong on feminism, but and there's a traditional sort of white middle class leaders of the feminist of the feminism movement who go back to the sort of the 1960s, and they've been sort of very predominant, and that they've sort of in a way formed that sort of gender critical movement, but at the same time they've been very strident and done brilliant work in changing the balance in terms of gender over the years. And obviously that there's been another the trans issue has become more important over the years, and more one that we've had to address. There's been a real sort of almost generational difference, and I think we're at that moment. I mean, I think the Guardian has had difficulty because there's sort of two entrenched views on this, but I think over time it's clear which way the direction is going, and we've had some sort of very difficult issues in which both sides feel silenced, both sides feel victimized in different ways and for different reasons, and both sides almost have a validity to what they're saying. So we're in a difficult place where everyone feels they're the victim and they're feeling wronged. But I do think that we've set up a trans inclusion discussion forum. I mean, part of this was all delayed by COVID and by the pandemic and the fact that we've been working from home. And so things that were intended to happen 2 years ago never actually happened. And every time we thought we were coming back into the office and able to have these meetings in person, they were sort of postponed. But we have started the discussions literally in the last couple of months. And I feel confident that we can come together. And I think what we'll end up with finding is a way for people to agree to disagree, but at least to agree to disagree respectfully and respecting each other. And I think too much of it has been dominated by social media, where people say things on social media and accuse people of all sorts of things, which just unhelpful. Like I say, in everything I've done in terms of race, I've tried to be polite and unthreatening and non-condemnatory. And I think that we need to take and again choose battles. And I think if we do things and stick to the facts and stick to things which are clear on either side of this, I think we can make progress. And I find it quite sad that when you've got the traditional feminist movement and the LGBTQ side, there's so much in common that both sides have, and yet it ends up being so fractious, and so people feel so the stances seem so rigid and so intolerant either way, when there is so much that people have in common, and so much understanding, and both sides know about the patriarchy and the evils of the patriarchy and everything else. So I think there's a lot of common ground that people can, and if we start talking about what we have in common rather than what divides us, and then find a way to sort of, as I say, we don't need to agree on everything, but at least let's do it respectfully. That's a very long answer, but it's quite a sensitive issue. So
I think the trans inclusive group sounds really positive, and I think it's so important for us to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable in our societies right across the board. And it's important that conversation is had. And I think the point about social media being quite toxic is really prevalent, because I think a lot of the stuff that is had over Twitter or in these forums can be quite snapshot and not have the nuance and be a bit binary. And I think it's important that we have those conversations properly and we support each other in the best way. So thank you. The next question is from Natalie. What key factors have contributed to a culture change at The Guardian rather than quick win tick box processes or tasks? It's like a tongue twister.
Well, I would say that the biggest factor, I would say, is actually having people. When I remember that very first interview we had in that very first year in 2002, and we had a woman in a hijab come in for the interview, and I'm pretty sure it was probably the first time a woman in a hijab had ever been inside a national newspaper office at all. And you can think, we take it much more for granted now, but it was that there were so many attitudes. There were the attitudes that people had at the time were Asian women are all dominated by rigid, domineering fathers who won't let them go into journalism or the professions. And then the Asian men, they all want to be doctors and lawyers and engineers, so they're not interested in careers here. But there was these people had built up stereotypes which were based on almost the earliest images of Asian people in Britain in the wave of migration in the 60s and 70s, when you had kind of sari wearing women and but there was no sense of, well, now we're dealing with women who were born in this country, who've been brought up in a British culture, obviously with Asian element as well, but predominantly in a British culture, who have very different attitudes and want to get on and want to succeed in this society. But it was so I think having people in the office who sort of completely belied the steps, who completely blew apart the stereotype. If you have, what is an Asian woman? And then, actually, this woman is Asian and she is completely unlike, and so is this woman. And this black woman, and we've got all these views about black women, or this black man, and we think about black men as being, so the lights keep going off. If I wave my hands near and so people they had this view of black people, Asian people. And in a way, that's been the most important thing, I think, just for senior editors to actually see people and realize, actually, what I thought about this whole group of people was completely wrong. And over time, that means that when jobs are advertised, when they see an Asian name on a job application form, they're not thinking, oh, that person has just come from India and they won't be able to speak the language. It means that they have much more of an understanding of different communities.
Brilliant. So getting more sort of people involved, but also looking at that implicit bias and things like that, and maybe microaggressions and stereotypes that people might hold. Okay, so I'm going to ask another question now. What do you think the most important actions that the media as a sector should introduce to the way the report is more balanced? An example is given here that research shows that more people of colour are reported in the media when violent crimes are committed than white people, and given a skewed public perception.
There's so many elements to that. At its heart, is the fact that the media, for all the people of colour in the media, and The Guardian is really making change in this, but we are all at junior levels. So if we are pitching I think if you go to just about every newspaper, the people making the decisions are all white. It's only white people in the room, and they come and they don't really meet many people of color at all, and they make decisions based on their biases. And I think that for the most part, they're very happy doing that. You see most of the newspaper front pages and the things that they say about Muslim people these days, in particular, are kind of shocking. And even the most middle, even so-called liberal organisations get this wrong. I mean, just last week there was a story about Telford and the grooming gangs in Telford, and obviously what the grooming gangs have done is appalling and has affected so many hundreds, if not thousands, of young girls across the country. But they moved from it being a case of a gang of 10 people or whatever who are committing these appalling, abominable crime, to then making a kind of stereotype about the whole of the Asian community or the whole of the Muslim community. And what is it about Muslimness which makes people do that? They don't do that, and another thing that came out, even in the top line in the story of reporting of Telford, was people didn't approach or prosecute these Asian grooming gangs because they were frightened of being called racist. I mean, have you ever heard of a police officer who doesn't do anything because he's frightened to be called racist? I mean, really, they go out, they arrest us on the street, they stop and search us, they kill us, they choke us. They're doing this stuff almost every day. They beat us up. They have never had any worries about being racist. You just see the latest, atrocity on Chelsea Bridge in London, where a guy's repeatedly tasered and then flees in a state of shock and jumps over the bridge and ends up drowning. The police treat us with suspicion, with brutality. They have not. Racism is the last thing. The idea that they would hold back on something for fear of being accused of being racist is ridiculous. And yet, when we all know that child abuse and child sexual abuse is perpetrated amongst so many communities, be it, we've heard about young footballers having it, the whole Jimmy Savile story, Cyril Smith in Rochdale, there's a whole ring of white politicians who were involved in child sex rings, not to mention the children's homes, the churches. There are so many, and in all of that, what they all have in common is that the children are never believed because they tend to be children from disadvantaged backgrounds, from what we used to call broken homes, and they are never believed. The police don't believe a word they say. That is why the perpetrators in Telford and Rotherham and all these other cities managed to get away with it. It's not because the police didn't were frightened of being called racist. Yet when that is reported as truth, it gives all white people across the country a sense of grievance, like, oh, somehow Asians get away with it. Somehow Black people get away with it because that they can do anything they like and get away with it. So it fuels this sort of white grievance, which is so damaging. And yet, and that's because that's, as I say, even the BBC reported it that way. And there are no people like us in the room to be able to challenge those. When editors are making decisions, there are no people in the room to challenge that. And what editors need to do what leaders need to do in all organizations is get people in the room and have a sort of like little jokey hashtag, why is my meeting white? That I think people need to look at when these decisions are being made, how inclusive are you? How racially diverse is the group of people making these decisions? And if it's a group of all white people, then think we need to have people of color here and helping us make better decisions. Because when you have that insight that other people can bring, whatever happens, you'll do it in a position of knowledge rather than ignorance.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just thinking we've got 5 minutes left. So I'm trying to look for a question, Matt, sort of summarise. So I know Lucy's asked about EDI is about helping organisations thrive. It's not about charity. I'm aware there have been various reports to present excellent evidence of the positive impact of diverse workforce and leadership and boards. Can you give any examples or refer us to links that you found useful in doing this type of work?
In terms of showing that the organisations make better decisions?
Yeah, so I think what Lucy was asking is have you got any resources, or you can point at the people on our talk today in any direction for resources that can help them with their EDI journeys?
In terms, there's not a lot of work that's been done in terms of diversity in journalism. I mean, a lot of it is underfunded and out of work. There's the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, which is based at Birmingham City University. And they've done a lot of work on, they've just been set up a couple of years ago, but they've already done quite a lot of work on the impact of, discrimination and institutional discrimination in the media industry. I would suggest maybe they would be the best place to start.
Brilliant, thanks so much. Another question is about how do you prioritise what needs to be done in terms of support in different sections if you have limited resources? Have you got any tips on that?
And maybe one thing I would say is that there were sort of a number of cases that came up in answer to the previous question. A number of cases came up in quick succession, which showed why the media needs diversity. And it was a few years ago, you'll remember, we had in Labour Party, we had the sort of Jeremy Corbyn effect, which no one predicted. We had the rise of Donald Trump, no one predicted. Brexit, no one in the mainstream media predicted that the referendum would go that way. We also had the Grenfell Tower, where even though the residents were campaigning for better safety in tower blocks, the media wasn't reporting it. And all of those show that up till that point, I think there'd been a kind of cozy consensus that the kind of very clever, very well-educated, white, Oxbridge, middle-class people knew everything, that they knew what was going on in the world, and that they were so well-read that they would understand and be able to translate the world and analyze it and offer their opinions on everything because they knew everything. And I think those stories that they all got badly wrong showed that, no matter how clever you are, you cannot know what's going on in the world from your ivory towers. That you need to have people who speak across the whole class, regional, ethnicity, all kinds of things. You need people from all kinds of backgrounds to be able to give you a sort of full picture of what's really going on. So I think that was just a good way, an example which highlighted why diversity and inclusion makes organizations better. I'm not the kind of person who says we need to spend lots of money on advisors or whatever, but I think there's a lot of things you can do. For example, just by rewording job adverts and making the wording more inclusive, you can bring in a new set of applicants. You need to reach out. The positive action scheme I run has no budget, all we have, it's a work experience. Like, you could criticize it for saying it's an unpaid work experience scheme, but we're in the national press, which is always going from one financial crisis after another. I just think it wouldn't have survived 20 years if it had been a paid-for scheme. But in the meantime, it has done a lot of great work for helping people on their journalism careers. So, and it just depends on, you bring people in. As I say, you can advertise it, and whether you do it for, this was a specific ethnic minority scheme. We've also do another one now. We've launched another one 10 years ago for people with disabilities. You could do a scheme like that for people based on their class or whatever that happens to be. Whatever your organization is failing in, wherever you need extra work, then you could target those groups. But yeah, it's basically, but it does send a signal that we are looking for different kinds of people. And now you can circulate, you can advertise it on social media, you can share it, you can bring people in through that way. Another thing we do is we have workshops. So we bring in people from different backgrounds, underrepresented groups, and they have workshops. So they come in, they learn. We have a session where they learn from, be it cartoonists or sports correspondents or whatever that happens to be, or features editors, and they can pitch their ideas. And it's like a group pitching session where they learn from everyone else and they learn about the kind of things that we're interested in, so they can they're better in a better place to pitch their ideas in future. So there are things like that can be done which they require a bit of resource, but it's not actual budget.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Joseph, for your insight and words today for the Inclusion Exchange and being part of the first Inclusion Exchange and the launch for this particular podcast. We will see you again for episode 2, and there will be more details to follow. Thanks very much, all.